Good afternoon, everybody. We are based in UK. I'm Shumon Shet, and welcome to our panel on multidimensional poverty. And my co-convener, Dennis Seving, is also here. So we have four presenters with us, and they are Kehinde Omosoto, Kofele Lokubane, Daniel Maleba, and Christopher Ngosa. We will try to go in order of these names. However, we may be a bit flexible if we find that some of our presenters are having problems. This is a very unusual circumstances this year, which is very unlike how conferences work in other years. We are probably almost all of us are at home and we are trying to connect. So the presenters will have around 17 to 20 minutes for their presentation. And then they will have 5 to 7 minutes for question and answers. So once each presenter finishes, we will be taking some questions and answers for 5-7 minutes. If you want to write your questions, that's fine. There should be a button called Ask, which you can click and write your question. We can display. You are also welcome to be at the podium, depending on your internet connection, and ask your questions live. So we are fine with either way. So first, we will try to start with Kehinde Omosoto with her presentation. Hi, looks like our first presenter is having some issue with internet connection. So we will start with Kofelo Lokobane with his presentation. Okay, so the stage is to Kofelo.
Okay, while you are uploading the presentation, good day, everyone. My name is Kofelo Lokobane. I'm a PhD researcher at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS in University of Sussex. Okay, I'll be presenting a paper on leaving no one behind, an individual level approach to measuring multidimensional poverty in Botswana. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, by way of introduction, the Leave No One Behind principle is at the core of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the LNOB acknowledges that poverty is multidimensional and is an individual concept. But notwithstanding this, most empirical studies have focused on household as the unit of analysis. But however, some studies have found that estimation of poverty levels at household level underestimates the overall poverty level of the society and does not capture the intra-household inequalities. Next. Next slide. So by way of rationale, globally, the SDG 1 calls for ending poverty in all its forms. This is a first recognition that poverty is multidimensional. Specifically, Target 1.2 states that by 2020, reduce at least half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions, according to national definitions. So we should not only look at poverty at multidimensional, but also recognize that poverty differs according to country context, and that it differs across different spheres of the demographic characteristics. Next slide. In the context of Botswana, Botswana has a new poverty eradication policy and strategy that is premised on the leaving no one behind principle. Similarly, the NDP 11 and the Vision 2036 articulates the need to measure multidimensional poverty. However, I should mention that even though Botswana has committed to leaving no one behind and has made numerous stands of multidimensional poverty, no study has been done to measure poverty from a multidimensional perspective. And this study constitutes the first attempt, and also to estimate poverty using individual as a unit of analysis. And we also intend to study inequality for the whole population. Next slide. Conceptually, this study intends to develop a country-specific individual-level multidimensional poverty measure, and also intends to operationalize the Leave No One Behind principle. Also, we want to provide estimates of multidimensional poverty measures for Botswana. Empirical, like I mentioned, this is the first study to undertake this attempt. You see a nationally representative data. Next slide. In terms of developing the measure, the study is conceptually grounded in the capability approach, including a wide range of functionings for the population. Like I indicated, we use individual as the unit of analysis. And in terms of weighting across dimensions, we adopt equal weighting. We deem the dimension to be equally important. Then also the Leave No One Behind is premised on the human rights approach, and rights are perceived to be equally important. In terms of aggregation, we use the Alkir and Foster methodology. And then in terms of measuring inequality, we use the Alkir and Seth 2014 methodology. Next slide. In terms of data, the study utilizes the 2015-16 Botswana Multi-Topic Household Survey. This is a nationally representative cross-sectional survey. It contains about 16 topical modules that will be used to derive different dimensions and indicators. The survey employed a two-stage stratified probability sample design. And I should mention that this study covers all the administrative districts in Botswana, so it is very representative. Next slide. In terms of dimensions and indicators, I have about 7 dimensions comprising of about 23 different indicators. And I should mention this, I obviously employed normative decision in terms of selecting the dimensions, and also looked at Botswana's development priorities, and also the, of course, the final selection was based on data availability. Next slide. In terms of deprivation in incidences, I've divided the population to 4 groups: children, youth, adults, and older persons. This was influenced by the different policies that we have in Botswana. For example, children is 0 to 17 years. So I followed the national policies that we have. And looking at the results, you can see that older persons experienced higher deprivations compared to other age groups. Next slide. And then in terms of multidimensional poverty incidences, I have highlighted older persons red because they experienced the highest poverty levels in terms of incidence, intensity, and also in terms of inequalities. You can see that inequality amongst the multidimensionally poor older persons is higher than the rest of the populations. And you can see that the poverty incidences decline with increase in age. And that is consistent among other poverty indicators. Next slide. And then in line with Leave No One Behind principle that calls for data disaggregation, I disaggregated the analysis into different subgroups of the population, gender, disability status, and so forth. And if you look at disability status, for example, you see very wide variation in terms of poverty levels, with persons with disability having higher levels of incidences, intensities, and also they have the higher MPI index. And then in terms of gender, even though the disparities are not that wide, they are significant, with females having higher poverty incidences than their male counterparts. And also, as expected, age of household heads, you find that those households headed by older persons and children have higher poverty incidences. Mainly, these are the groups that are not very economically active. And in most cases, you find that, for example, in households headed by children, these are orphan children. And then in terms of marital status, the results, poverty levels are lower amongst households headed by married couples. Next slide. Then I also assess poverty incidences by administrative district. These are district, they vary in terms of populations, in terms of livelihoods and so forth. So you see a wide disparities in terms of poverty incidence across districts. For example, if you look at the list of poor district, Suwa Town is less than 5%, but if you look at the district with the highest poverty incidences is more than 10 times the one with the lowest poverty incidence. So you can see the huge disparities there in terms of our districts. Next slides. Then we also, like I indicated, we also assess the level of inequality amongst the multidimensional poor following Al-Kir and Seth methodology. I've provided a graph there, and you can see that inequality amongst the poor versus the MPI. So you can see wide variation across districts in terms of inequality amongst the multidimensional poor. For example, if you take CBT, CT, those are administrative districts in Botswana. They have the same MPI value of 0.277. But in terms of inequality, you can see CBT is like high on that graph, showing that even though they have got the same MPI values, they exist disparity in terms of inequality amongst the multidimensionally poor. Next slide. So in terms of our findings, like in sum, I can say the extent and the nature of multidimensional poverty vary significantly across different subgroups of the population, as shown by the previous results. And the left behind, that is the multidimensionally poor, are mostly older persons and persons with disability, especially those residing in rural areas. And these results are consistent with the inequality results are also consistent with those of multidimensional poverty measures and also deprivation incidences. Like I said, also in terms of the household or family structure, we find that families with larger household sizes, those headed by unmarried couples, and those headed by either the elderly or young or children have higher poverty levels. And then also there are disparities across districts, especially rural areas. Next slide. So in conclusion, the study provides policy implications for adopting and using the individual-based multidimensional poverty measure. First, this measure can be used as a tool in terms of monitoring the progress in national developments as outlined by the Botswana Poverty Eradication Policy Strategy, the Vision 2036, and the NDPs. And also, there is need to emphasize the importance of the multidimensional individual level poverty measure in identifying the poor, especially for policymakers, so that nationally appropriate social protection systems can be put in place and to be able to cover those identified as left behind. And then this measure can be used and targeting effectiveness of social protection systems on reaching the poor. And finally, I hope this paper will set a baseline study, a basis of further discussions, and also can stimulate debates among researchers, policymakers, regarding the need for adopting the individual-based multidimensional poverty measure in Botswana. I thank you very much for listening. I'll be waiting for the comments and answers. Thank you very much. Seth?
Thank you very much, Kofelo. Of course, you were within time. Thank you very much. So it was a nice presentation, summarize multidimensional poverty in Botswana, and also trying to show how the inequality of poor varies across regions as well. Now the floor is open for questions from our audience. So please either type your questions or comments, or if you have any question, raise your hands and we can bring you to the podium.
Hi, Joe Clancy, the University of Twente in the Netherlands. I liked your presentation very much indeed, so very interesting. However, it's very descriptive. Do you have any explanations for why you're seeing the different levels of poverty in the different districts in Botswana? Are you able to offer any insights into that? And I'm very pleased that that the disaggregation levels that you use, that you took a much more intersectional approach, and I like particularly the difference in the age groups as well. So well done, thank you. I'll certainly read the paper.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy.
Okay, yes, why don't you go ahead and respond to Joy's questions, because we do not have any raised hands yet. So by the time more questions may come. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Joy, for your question, and thank you for appreciating my research. Why poverty levels vary across different districts? I should mention that, like I indicated, these are administrative districts. And you find that this district cover the diverse different regions of the country. For example, the higher poverty incidences, for example, in Kweneng West is not surprising. This is one of the poorest districts in terms of income poverty. But again, if you look at developments into this district, the district is less developed. Access to schools, senior schools is very low because people have to travel from that district to the nearest district to access senior secondary schools. And then also in terms of health facilities, mostly it's health posts, not hospitals. So you see, the district is so disadvantaged in terms of a lot of areas of development. And then you look at the district with the lowest poverty incidences. That's Swatown. That's a mining town. So it is not surprising that it has the lowest levels, because you find that mostly mining towns are well developed towns, and you find that also the facilities like hospitals, schools are built by the mining towns. So you can see the disparities are mostly structural. So hence those different variations in terms of poverty levels and deprivations.
Okay, good, thank you. We have another question. I am bringing Mary-Louise Mattis on spotlight.
Hello, and thank you very much for your super interesting presentation. I would like to learn more about the indicators you used. There were 23, if I'm not mistaken, and to me, many of them looked like they're actually measured on the household level, so the quality of the housing. And I would like to understand which of these are actually measured on an individual level and which made the greatest difference. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Mary-Louise, thank you very much. True, some indicators are captured at household level, And if I think in the presentation I had provided a table of indicators and deprivations, but I should admit that there are some conceptual challenges, especially as those indicators that are defined and identified at household level. For example, housing and living conditions, water and sanitation, and asset indicators. Most of these are public in nature within households, and conceptualizing them is a challenge. Therefore, the indicators are assumed to be true public goods, equally accessible to all individuals and within a household. And therefore, I made an assumption that these are equally accessed at household level. But if you look at some other indicators, like, for example, nutrition indicators that are identified at household level. For example, the global MPI identified indicators at household level. Like if, for example, a kid is deprived in nutrition, and then that household and its members are assumed to be deprived in nutrition. So in this case, we're trying to make some distinction to say there may be 4 kids in that same household, 2 maybe malnourished, but 2 not malnourished. So we are trying to make those distinctions, especially if we want to address the leave no one behind objective. And again, like I indicated, intra-household allocations, so that we are able to assess the poverty levels by demographic characteristics like the gender of an individual, age, and so forth. But I should admit the limitation is that some of the indicators, yes, are identified at household level. So maybe going forward, it is to say that we try to collect data that is individual specific, so that we try on improving this measure, so that we try by all means to capture the individualistic nature of poverty. Thank you.
Great. We have not got more questions, but Kofelo, I would like to add, it would be good to see,
yes.
There are definitely, as the questions suggest, there are inherent arbitrariness in your selection of indicators, selection of cutoffs, selection of the poverty cutoff itself. So it may be a good idea to also show some sort of, perform some sort of robustness tests.
Yes.
With respect to these indicators, try to show with different values of K, So one thing you probably ought to think about a bit more about sort of the policy questions. You present the incidents, you present the inequality and so on, but it would be good to spotlight what is the policy implication of your findings. Where do you stand in terms of policy?
Okay.
It will improve your paper.
Thank you, Seth. And thank you for your comment on robustness testing. And I should admit that I didn't present that part, but I have undertaken several robustness tests in terms of varying the poverty cutoffs,
right,
and also trying to vary the weightings of indicators.
Okay. And your results are more or less robust.
I'll definitely share the paper with you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I'll definitely share the paper with you for your comments. And also I have noted the comment on spotlighting the policy implications.
Right. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. If there is no other question, also, of course, there is time for one more question, but I do not see raised hands. So we may move to our next presentation with Kehinde Omosoto. And thank you very much, Kofelo.
Yeah, that is the topic, measuring the vulnerability of borderline non-poor individuals to multidimensional poverty. Please note this is a work in progress, and I would appreciate your critique of the paper. Thank you. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So this is just the overview of the presentation. I will talk briefly on the introduction, the contribution, the method, the results, and then I conclude. Can I have the next slide? Yeah. You would agree with me that the debate around the definition and measurement of vulnerability to poverty, especially multidimensional poverty, is a growing one, and there is still a of economic growth, and they also see it as those in the middle of national distributions. They are sometimes referred to the empowered. Okay, yeah. So, specifically in post-apartheid South Africa, there is the surge in the middle class. You know, after the end of the apartheid, there has been an increase in the proportion of those people classified as in the middle class, and this has led to a lot of exciting academic discourse on vulnerability to poverty, like I told you earlier. You know, to some sociologists and economists, you know, those people that are vulnerable are those people within the middle of the income distribution, and they are sometimes referred to as this middle class. However, previous research, sometimes they have most people that have been classified initially as poor now, you know, they are now more vulnerable even to more chronic poverty. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, so building on the existing theoretical framework, I define individuals or households that are vulnerable as those ones that are below the middle income, that's below the poverty threshold, which are mostly determined by researchers or by, just like in the case of a multidimensional poverty. So this both empirical and conceptual contributions to the literature by constructing some measures of vulnerability to multidimensional poverty. The conceptual contribution argues for a consideration of social stratification that takes into account socioeconomic shocks and volatility, just like we are witnessing right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in the definition and measurement of poverty, because a lot of emphasis is always on the poor, and little is talked about those that are actually vulnerable, that miss the threshold narrowly. You know, the empirical contribution proposes a pragmatic framework and, by extension, a social policy that will identify and classify non-individuals with different levels of vulnerabilities to poverty, even within the context of the multidimensional poverty. Next slide. Households that fall into multidimensional poverty or that narrowly escape poverty, but they are still poor, you know. But sometimes people do not see them as poor because they do not fall within that range of multidimensional poverty per se. So the empirical analysis is based on the adaptation of the Hacker-Foster multidimensional poverty strategy, and the Hacker-Foster method basically takes into consideration multiple forms of deprivation experienced simultaneously by individuals at any given point in time. I know some of us are already familiar with that. We adapted the AIF method to the population-weighted general household surveys of 2002 and 2017. That's South African household survey. So we tried to see the changes that have taken place over time in the proportion of those people that are vulnerable to multidimensional poverty, and those people that are actually poor, and those people that are living in chronic poverty, using that using the general household survey data. Next slide, please. Let me talk briefly about the data. This general household survey is a repeated cross-sectional household survey that is a survey that is taken every year with different observations. They are national representative, both at the provincial level and the rural urban level. The sample include approximately 20 to 30,000 households annually. Then it uses the multi-stratified design. The population weights are available for both households and individuals so that we can make the sample more representative in our empirical analysis. Then the survey collects information on general well-being and standard of living, and it also collects a range of demographic and socioeconomic information. The data is publicly available to anyone that want to access it and use it for empirical analysis. The data was analyzed using Stata version 15. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay, before I show you the results, we use in constructing a vulnerability threshold, we use 4 dimensions. And we use 18 indicators. I'm sorry, this here. The 4 dimensions are education, health, living standard. Okay. Education, health, living standard will include economic inactivity. Given that South Africa, under the economic inactivity, unemployment was the key variable there, indicator there, given the high rate of unemployment in the country. And we use the standard individual and household indicators. So I will briefly talk about the results. The results here, what we got on the sensor vulnerability head count ratio is at about 25.3% vulnerable to poverty. If you look carefully, this is the censored vulnerability head count ratio as opposed to the conventional head count ratio, the censored head count ratio. We discovered that 23% are vulnerable to poverty, and the vulnerability intensity is about 16.9. Then the vulnerability index, which is the equivalent of the multidimensional index, is about 4.3%. Then we also calculated the multidimensional poverty index, which is about 0. For 2002, the one I'm reporting for 2002 is about 13.8. But what we observe here is that there have been reductions in each of these indicators. To some extent, we can see that the sensor vulnerability head count ratio, which indicate the proportion of those people that are actually vulnerable at less than 30%, 30% of the weighted indicators, it has reduced sharply from 25.3% to like 9.1%. We also noticed reduction in vulnerability index from 4.3 to 2.4. Then the multidimensional index also reduced from like 13.8 to 7.5%. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, this is very interesting. Here we compare the vulnerability and the poverty thresholds for the 2 years to know the changes, the temporal changes that have taken place over time. Okay, as you can see from the graph, it's clear that there have been reduction. But what is interesting here is that the number of people, the proportions of people, or the percentage of people, of individuals that are actually vulnerable to poverty are more than the proportion that are poor, that are multidimensionally poor. And like I told you earlier that, in policy discourse about poverty, the emphasis is always on this particular group of people, the people that are actually multidimensionally poor. But we discovered the people that are at the verge of poverty, that at any slight shock, they would just fall into poverty. they are higher than the people that are actually poor. And most of the time, policy doesn't take care of those because, programs or activities are tailored towards this particular group of people. I mean, the people that are actually multidimensionally poor. So it's so glaring there now that those people that are below this threshold of 33.3%, which are classified as poor, these other categories that are vulnerable to poverty, they are more than people that are poor. Yeah, of course, we notice reduction in each of the categories. I mean, in each of the thresholds. Across this threshold, we know that the proportion of people that are vulnerable have been reducing, but however, the proportion is still higher than those people that are actually poor, that are multidimensionally poor for both years. Next slide, please. Yeah, what we did there is to disaggregate the censored vulnerability head count by social dimension. And what we see here is that economic inactivity, that is unemployment, contributes the most to vulnerability. South Africa currently, the employment rate is at 29.1%. And undoubtedly, there is high unemployment rate in South Africa, and it's one of the dimensions that contributes, as we find out, is one of the key dimensions that contributes to the proportion of people who are prone to poverty at any slightest shock. Okay, so I try to decompose the censored vulnerability at count by some social demographic factor. Like I told you earlier, this is still work in progress. This is not too informative, but I think the key message here is that the proportion of people that are poor, that are vulnerable to poverty, to multidimensional poverty, are higher, and the policy should be directed to kind of include them in any program, in any program that could improve their condition, that could take them out of poverty, so to speak. So next slide, please. Yeah. So, like I told you, the key findings just suggest that the proportion of I call them the non-poor because most of the time they're not classified as poor. Like I said earlier, the proportion of those categories of individuals or households remain relatively higher than those who are poor, actually living in chronic poverty. I define those people that are living in chronic poverty as those people whose weighted average indicators are above 50% or at 50% or more. So notably, vulnerability to poverty among those aged 65 years and beyond declined over time. That is, the rate at which those that are aged 65 years and above are vulnerable to poverty is lower than those younger ones. And you would agree with me, since unemployment contributes significantly to vulnerability to poverty, and those people aged 65 years and above, most of them are retired and not working. So we expect that vulnerability to poverty will be higher among people that are aged less than 65 years, as opposed to those that are above that age. Then the Black Africans, the female-headed households, and rural dwellers are more vulnerable to multidimensional poverty than their respective counterparts. That is one of our main findings. Then unemployment, either in form of underemployment or precarious employment, contributes significantly to vulnerability to multidimensional poverty. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, stable employment still remains a very key, a key escape route from poverty and vulnerability, especially within the African context. In an household where people are not employed, where at least a member of the family is not employed, you would agree with me house, even if they are on social grants or other forms of social assistance, the level of vulnerability to poverty in case such grants or remittances ceases or stops will be higher than households where there is a stable employment. Then there should be a review of existing social policy to integrate some of this, to integrate the specific needs of the identified vulnerable population. What we are trying to clamor for here is that social policy should be designed in such a way that the vulnerable group should be included in some of their discourse, in some of their programs and activities targeted as reducing poverty generally, because most of the time the emphasis is always on the poor, people that are poor, people that don't have. But there are some people that are working poor, that at a very slight economic shock, then they fall into poverty. So the policy should also include should also, try to integrate them into the broader discourse on how to alleviate poverty generally. Thank you so much for your time.
Hi, thank you very much, Kehinde. And we have successfully finished the presentation despite challenging internet connections. So congratulations. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, which sort of shows why it is important to focus not only just those below the poverty line because of a set cutoff, but also to look at those who are residing just above the poverty line. And this has always been a concern that how about those that are living just above the poverty line? And this current global crisis has shown worldwide that how these people can easily fall in poverty trap if we do not have a good social networking system. Okay, so I now open the floor for questions, which we have around 5 minutes for questions and answers. I think I saw Kitty. There you go. Kitty's already there.
Thank you.
There you go, Kitty.
Thank you. And thank you, Kehinde, for your presentation. It's very interesting. And I have two questions. One is about the findings. Maybe I misread and maybe I misheard, but I think I saw that the vulnerability to poverty and the poverty rates reduced. But in the one table with your figures, it looked like the intensity had increased over time. And if that's the case, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why that happens. And then my second question is a bit more hypothetical. So you've already referred to COVID and the importance of focusing on vulnerability because of the crisis. And I was wondering if you could say anything about any discussion within South Africa about how the pandemic might be contributing towards greater vulnerability or greater multidimensional poverty, particularly because of the big role of economic inactivity and unemployment in your findings. Thank you.
Okay, the vulnerability index actually shows a decline from about 4.3 to 2.4%. They have been declined, but the main argument I put forward in that paper is just that, okay, there might be a decline, but the proportion of those people that are vulnerable to poverty remains quite relatively higher than those people who are poor. And if I heard correctly, you asked about the COVID-19, how you would agree with me all over the world. The COVID-19, the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic has caused a lot of vulnerability, has led to a lot of people, that are in employment before, now they're unemployed. And those people that are doing something before, they can do it again. And it has exposed a lot of people to being vulnerable to multidimensional poverty, actually in terms of employment. And like I told you earlier, I find out that unemployment was a key contributor to vulnerability to poverty, to multidimensional poverty. So going forward now, although I don't have the analysis, if you could see, I used 2002 and 2017 just to do the comparison. So maybe I would need to get, you know, an updated or a recent data to explore, you know, how things have changed over time. You know, I can't give a definite answer until I do the analysis, but I want to believe, you know, it would have increased over time. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Kitty.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have another question from Beatrice from the audience, and the question is: to what extent are those vulnerable to poverty covered by social protection programs, and has the social protection response to COVID-19 expanded to cover these individuals?
Okay, if I understand this question clearly, South Africa is one of the African countries that have a very, to some extent, robust social protection program in terms of old age pension. We have the child support grant. We have like many grants, veteran grants, and all of that. Yeah. Yeah, it was covered in this. My apologies. I didn't show you the indicators and the dimensions. That I'm so sorry, that slide was missing there.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, okay. So you would have seen there that under the unemployment, I tried to cover those people that are not unemployed, that they still have access to social grants. Okay. That is, maybe a person is in a household, a member there is not unemployed, but at least one member collects social grants. So right. It shows that unemployment, I mean, this unemployment indicator there still shows that the highest contributor to vulnerability. So yeah, it has helped, but still, we still need a stable employment because the money is not really much. That's why the fact that have been increased. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I do not see any other questions from our audience. And also, I think the time is running. Oh, we have another question? Okay.
I have another question.
Sure. Okay, sure. Please go ahead. We can take one more question.
I'm Beatrice. I'm a researcher at the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth. And my question is actually more related to social protection. So I was wondering, your findings seem to coincide about what people working with social protection have been talking about in terms of the missing middle. So I was wondering if you know if those marginally non-poor are being covered by any social protection program right now, and if measures addressing the COVID-19 pandemic have expanded any social protection programs to cover more individuals from that group. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Beatrice. I think Kehinde spoke a little bit about answering your question because it's somehow the question got lost and I read to Kehinde. Please go ahead, Kehinde, if you want to briefly respond. You have another minute.
Yeah. Currently, because of the impact, the short-term impact, and of course the long-term impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government has expanded the social protection, the social grants scheme here by increasing the child support grants and old age pension, I think, by almost 350 rand or so, by some proportions, just in an attempt to cushion the effects of the COVID-19. So in my further analysis, I told you this is a work in progress.
Yeah.
In my further analysis, all this will be taken into consideration to take care of all the increases and all the increases and the efforts to cushion the effects of the pandemic on the South
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kehinde. Thank you very much. So we will now move on to our next presentation by Daniel Maleba.
Perfect.
There you go.
Great. Thank you very much. And a warm welcome also from my side. And despite the circumstances, I think it's nice to see many of you virtually attending this conference and especially this panel. So before I start with the content, I have to say that this is joint work with my colleague at the German Development Institute, Francesco Burchi, who is also online, and he will answer to all the difficult questions. And most importantly, this is an ongoing work, and it's part also of a more longer-term project that we have at the German Development Institute on multidimensional poverty. So if you have any questions about the project itself, feel free to contact us afterwards. And I also think that our presentation fits very well and after the previous two presentations. And the reason why I'm saying this is that there are some similarities in a way that we also use an individual index of multidimensional poverty in our work. And also we use this individual index of multidimensional poverty in order to assess gender differences in multidimensional poverty, which was something that was touched also in the last presentation. And we do not do this just for one country, but we assess gender disparities for a large set of lower middle income countries. So in the next slide, I just want to kind of show what I will quickly do in the presentation. So we'll go through the background of why we started doing this research and present the index or the indices that we use, looking at the objectives and the research questions, and especially also the data that we use. Then I'll go through the results, and then we'll conclude the conclusions going back to the original research questions. As I said, this is a work in progress, so any suggestions or any remark that you have for us in our work will be very much appreciated. So in the next slide, we ask ourselves, we start with the background of the paper. So the background of the paper is that, especially since the inception of the SDG, there is a huge demand in kind of better understanding what are the gender differences in poverty levels. And this comes from, for example, the SDG 1, which mentions directly poverty of males and females, but of course also on SDG 5, which is main focus on gender equality. And the reason why there is a huge demand and a huge need of data is that despite this question or these policy issues is very relevant, we do not know much about it empirically until now. So in the previous decades, what we knew were mainly figures that were based on anecdotal evidence or were kind of announcements made at famous conference. So we put here the example of the 1995 World Conference on Women in Beijing, where one of the statements was that 70% of the world's poor are women. And then there was also a feminization of poverty, meaning that this trend of higher poverty for women was actually increasing. But these statements, despite being used by many, were actually never empirically proven, and so there was a lot of criticism behind if these statements were true or not. So this was the background showing that there was not much empirical evidence in the past decades. And against this background, there has been some improvements in looking at gender differences in poverty. And these improvements came firstly from an income poverty perspective. And income poverty started looking at differences in gender in two ways. So the first way, which you can see at the end of these slides, is by counting the number of women and men that are living in income-poor households. So as you can see, there is here a very strong assumption, which means that the income in the households is distributed equally among all the members of the households, and therefore, by doing this, we do not account for intra-households inequalities. And so this is a very strong assumption. And what has been found by using this method, there was a recent paper by Castañeda et al. And his colleagues at the World Bank, they showed that by counting just men and women in income-poor households, there is no significant gender difference at the global level. So the share of women or men and women in poverty, in income poverty, are more or less the same. In the next slide, we talk also about the second methodology that has been used in income poverty to look at whether female poverty or poverty among women is higher than among men, which is to consider the head of the household. So the second approach consists in comparing female-headed against male-headed households. And by using this approach, it has been shown that on the other side, actually male-headed households are actually have witnessed a higher poverty than female ones globally, and this comes from the same paper. Or also in Latin America, for example, there was no significant gender differences when we compare the head of the households. Now, while with the previous method, there was the assumption that income was distributed equally within the households, also in considering the heads of the household, we have some very strong assumption. One is, for example, that the gender of the head of the households is endogenous. So, for example, if you think at the head of a household being a female, for example, because the male partner had to migrate and is sending back remittances. And this problem of endogeneity then can really skew the estimates. Another problem is, for example, the composition of female-headed household that varies a lot across contexts, and in some contexts you have dependency rates in female-headed household that can be very, very high. And the third endogeneity, or the third problem of this method, is that the information on who's actually the head of the household is self-reported, and this can depend a lot on social norms. So it's not clear if what is reported is actually what is actually happening on the true information. So despite some improvements in looking at gender difference in income poverty, there are still a lot of shortcomings based on the assumptions. Now we also need to improve our understanding of gender disparity, not just in income poverty, but also multidimensional poverty, which is again one of the focuses on the SDG. And until now, there has not been much development, first because the main indexes of multidimensional poverty, such as the MPI, are still based at the household level. So they suffer some of the problems that I previously outlined. And the only studies that have been done recently, so there was one on Nicaragua from Espinosa Delgado and Klassen, are mainly related to specific countries and look at specific points in time. So it's very difficult to then come up with a more aggregate figure of gender disparities in multidimensional poverty. So in the next slide, yeah, exactly. So we start from this kind of background of very poor information of gender disparities in multidimensional poverty, and we want to fill this gap. And we rely on individual-based indices of multidimensional poverty, and especially we use two that we call the GCSPI and the GM0, which I will explain shortly. And these individual-based indices of multidimensional poverty consider some key dimensions that are especially important for women, which is our education, access to water and sanitation, which are used as proxy for health, and also decent work. And the main objectives of the paper and our research are two. One is from a static perspective, looking at the gender difference and disparities in multidimensional poverty. So looking whether at the beginning of the 21st century, actually the multidimensional poverty for women was higher than men, as many claimed. And the second objective is more a dynamic objective. So looking if the disparities that we see at the beginning of the millennium, of the century, have improved or not in the last 2 decades. So we have a static and an a dynamic objective. So now we go to in the next slide on the data and methods. So as the data, for space reasons, I did not present it here. The data that we use comes from the I2D2 database, so the International Income Distribution Database, which is a database of household surveys which is collected from the World Bank from many countries. All these databases are nationally representative, and they have standardized variables among them, so you can compare different countries. And so this is the base of our analysis. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, our indicator of multidimensional poverty has 3 dimensions. And these 3 dimensions were chosen through a constitutional approach, which means that several constitutions from several countries were analyzed, and we came up with a list of the dimensions that were mostly shared from between constitutions. And then we confronted these dimensions that we came up with the data at hand from the I2D2. And we ended up with the table that you see in this slide. So for the dimension of adequate, for fulfilling work, adequate employment, we use 2 different variables, which is the employment the labor force participation status and the employment status. And we consider a person which is deprived, whether if the person is unemployed, or whether a person is employed but is employed in a low pay and a low quality sector job. So this is for the side of the fulfilling work. For the looking at deprivation from the educational side, we used 3 different variables. So we start with the variable on literacy. So we consider an individual deprived if the person is unable to read, write, or both. If this information is not available for at least 2/3 of the individuals in the country in the sample, we look at the years of education and we use as cutoff 4 years of education. And again, if this variable is not available for at least 66% of the sample, we look at whether a person has or not education. And for the health variable, we use access to water and sanitation. This proxy is health, and this is also given because there is problems in finding variables related to health. And we consider an individual as deprived if the person has no access to drinkable water and has no access to adequate sanitation. One limitation that we also mentioned in the conclusion is that this variable is at the household level, not at the individual level. Again, it's for data constraints. And one thing that we do is that while in the normal indexes, all these 3 dimensions have the same weight, we also do robustness checks by giving this access to water and sanitation dimension a smaller weight of 20%. So now that we have these 3 dimensions, each of them have the same weight of 1/3 that we apply to them. We use 2 indices, so the GM0, which uses the M0 from the family of measure of Alcaro and Foster, and we consider the measure with K equal to 1, meaning that an individual is in poverty if it's deprived in at least one of the dimensions. And then we use the second individual multidimensional poverty index that we use is the GCSPI, which comes from the CSPI measure, which was originally developed by Ripin. And the advantage of these measures are, on one side, the GM0 is fully decomposable by dimension, so we can fully decompose and understand which of the 3 dimensions drives the values of multidimensional poverty. While on the other side, the GCSPI has the advantage that includes also a component of inequality. So in a way, the GCSPI can be decomposed in the 3 I's of poverty: incidence, intensity, and inequality. So as you see in the next slide, we end up with around 550 surveys and 108 countries with the original data set. But as I said before, we look at, we want to have more a dynamic perspective. So see the changes between 2000 and the latest survey that we have. So we choose to look at, first of all, a baseline, which is around 2000. So we choose countries which have a survey at least between 1997 and 2003. And then these countries need also to have an end line, which is another observation, which is at least 5 years of distance from this baseline observation that we previously chose. So these were the 2 requirements from the initial database. So from the initial database of 180 countries, we end up with a sample of 55 low and middle income countries. And for the analysis, the indicator that we look at is the female-male poverty ratio, which means the ratio between the female multidimensional poverty and the male multidimensional poverty. And we look at both the GM0 and the GCSPI together with the headcount, which we do not present much in this presentation due to time. And in the next slide, just to give you an idea of the 55 countries that we have in the sample for this paper, you can see on the left-hand side figure that the majority are countries from Sub-Saharan Africa, so 19 of the 55, and Latin America and the Caribbean, so 17 countries. And the other countries are from Asia and Europe. On the other hand, on the figure on the bottom, you can see that, again, the majority of countries, so 27 of the 55, are countries from are low-income countries, while the rest are lower middle income or upper middle income countries. So we have quite a good heterogeneous and big sample. Now, going at the results from the next slides. So not the next slide, I think, but the slides before. Again, next slide. We see that at 2000, so the baseline year, we see that there is actually not much of the gender bias, because we see that for 27 countries, female poverty is higher than male poverty, and for 28 countries, male poverty is higher than female one. So this seems a little bit to contrast with the claim that 70% of the poor were women. And you can see in the graph, the red line is where the ratio is equal to 1, meaning that female poverty is equal to male poverty. So above, countries with the bar finishing above the red line means that for them, female poverty was higher. In the next slide, once we have this message, we can see that actually the fact that there seems to be no female poverty doesn't seem to be higher than male poverty actually covers a lot of heterogeneity by regions and income groups. So in the left-hand side graph, you can see that female poverty is much higher in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So in sub-Saharan Africa, 84% of the countries show higher poverty rates for females. The country is, on the other hand, true for countries in Europe and East Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. On the other hand, if you look at income groups, which is of course rated also to regions, you see that for around 2/3 of the countries, of low-income countries, poverty is higher for females and males, and the contrary is true for for middle-income countries. So in a way, poverty is higher for females, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and low-income countries. Now, in the next slide, we conclude the analysis, the static analysis, by showing that the deprivations among the 3 dimensions that we've seen before, we've seen that female deprivations are especially high in education, while, for example, if we look at employment and health, deprivations are higher for females. So if in those countries where female poverty is higher, this higher female poverty is mainly driven by deprivations in education. And to summarize this finding, in the next slide, we start from the premise that Esther Duflo did in one paper, showing that economic development is important for gender equality. And we actually confirm that the ratio, so that the female poverty is higher than male poverty at very low levels of GDP, and then the relationship flattens out at higher levels of GDP. So this was the static analysis done at 2000. So the starting point of our analysis, but what actually happens, what actually happened from 2000 to 2010 circa. So in the next slide, we can see that from 2000 and 2012, we have the majority of country, the female to male ratio has actually increased. So we can see that there was actually a weak process of feminization of poverty. Again, when the bar is above the zero line, it means that female poverty increased more than male poverty proportionally. So for the majority of countries, there was an increase of female poverty compared to male poverty. And in the next slide, we can see that this is a bit the contrary to what we found from the static perspective, in a sense that female poverty increased more than male poverty, especially in upper middle income countries and Europe and East Asia, that actually started with lower female to male poverty ratio. So there seems to be a sort of convergence dynamic. And in the next slide, the same convergence dynamic can be seen. Sorry, I get next slide again. Can we go on the next slide again? So skipping this slide. Okay, so this convergence can be also seen from a dimensional perspective in a way that females are getting poorer in some countries from the employment perspective and less poor from an education perspective. So again, here it seems that there is a convergence also in the dimension space. So in the next two slides, we then summarize the conclusion that we have. And to go back again to the study, we studied gender disparity in multidimensional poverty across 55 lower middle income countries. And we wanted to answer to two questions. The first question was whether female poverty is higher compared to male poverty. And we look at 2000 as the year. And we found that overall, there seems to be no big difference across the countries in our sample, but what we find is that there is a lot of difference between regions and income groups. So, for example, sub-Saharan Africa and lower income countries show much higher female poverty rates compared to male poverty rates, and females have much higher deprivations in education and lower in employment. In the next slide, on the other hand, we then look at the second research question, which was whether these gender differences change over time. And we noticed that there is a weak process of feminization of poverty. And compared to the static picture, we have that upper middle income countries, Latin America, show some sort of feminization of poverty. And just to conclude, I want to just remind to the limitations of the study. One was about using access to water and sanitation as a proxy for health, which was at the household level and not at the individual level. The second is that, of course, we do not include some dimensions that are crucial for gender disparity, such as voice and agency. And the last point is that we focus on adults 15-65, and we exclude children and elderly, whose exclusion is not really certain in terms of the direction of changes in our variables. So this is it, and sorry to rush about the results, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a beautiful presentation, and of course, you are on time. So now it's question and answer time, and both Daniel and Daniel's co-author, Francisco, they both are on podium now to take question and answer. So the floor is open to the audience. Please raise your hand or post your question to proceed. By the time the audience comes up with a question, let me ask a quick question to you, which is, as you mentioned, that the new index that you use is broken down into incident, intensity, and inequality. What kind of inequality measure do you use?
You want to go, Francesco, or you want me to go?
You can start and I can step in if you want.
So I didn't present it mainly because also computationally is very complicated to present, especially in a short presentation. We used how do you say
generalized?
Yeah, generalized entropy index, but it
coefficient of variation square.
Yes, exactly. So 1 plus general entropy index squared. There, so yeah, so it can be. It means that is fully decomposable in terms of the components with incidence and the head count. But yeah, the GM0 is better in decomposing the different dimensions.
For inequality, it's just a note of caution. Please be careful. That's a bounded variable what you are using.
Yeah.
So in general, what will happen if you divide by intensity, which you are doing, is the average deprivation share for generalized entropy, you may have a sort of artificial inflation in your inequality. So this is, again, it's a research in progress. And I think what I and Sabina, we try to do is come up with a different inequality index, is more consistent inequality index proposed by Bohong Zheng as well, which means use an absolute measure and which may give you a quite different picture. And I think it has been used by Cafello in the first presentation as well. It's just a note of caution. We are still working on it. It's still not 100% finished, but just a note of caution, just so that if you want to. We have another question from Kitty. So let's use the time for Q&A. Kitty.
Hi. That was very interesting. Thank you. And also, I think it builds on what you presented last year, which is really interesting. So I have a question about the findings, and particularly the somewhat depressing finding that you find some feminization of poverty over time. And I was wondering whether that's also education that drives this greater feminization, or whether it's a different dimension, and whether that differs between regions.
You want me to go or you go?
Go ahead.
Thank you for the question, and the answer is that no, it's not education, it's mainly the employment variable. And the reason for that is that you can see, for example, for many countries, especially Latin America, to start with, they have labor force participation of women is very low, so around 50% or even lower. And given the construction of our measure, if you're outside the labor force, you're not deprived in that variable. Well, when you enter the labor force, depending on the job you have, then you can become deprived. So the small feminization process on some of the countries may be given by females or women entering the labor force and may be deprived in that dimensions more than from the education variable perspective.
Yeah, and in the static analysis, so in 2000, actually education doesn't explain much of poverty among males, while it plays not so relevant but much more important than for males among females. So yeah, this is a bit the static picture in 2000, but Daniela explained very well the overall evolution of gender disparity across time.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Marie-Louise.
So I'm really intrigued by your fulfilling work dimension, and I find it very interesting that you don't use assets at all. I work in Nepal, in a region where most people are farmers, so they are not employed and they don't seek a job because they do have a farm. However, some of these farms are really big and some are really small, and some of the farmers are definitely poor. Now, if we assume that schooling and sanitations were the same between two households, would your index make a difference between a poor and a rich farmer?
So maybe I can step in. So a more general question. So the reason, the general comment, the reason why we include the decent employment there is not only because it, of course, triggers or improves earnings and economic condition, but employment is important per se because in fact, we refer actually more than to decent employment, which is the ILO definition. We refer to what Amartya Sen calls fulfilling employment. So all the things that having a good quality employment brings. So it's not only about the remuneration. And since we used, since the very beginning, the capability approach as a conceptual framework to assess and measure poverty, we do not include assets, because assets are something that people own, is not really related to the what Amartya Sen calls the capabilities and functionings of individuals. So we decided on purpose to leave aside asset, and for example, with regard to access to adequate sanitation and potable water, we consider that not an asset, but something strictly related to key functioning for a decent life. So this is the main argument why we decided, regarding of the place, not to include assets in our measure. And yeah, we started the whole analysis and measurement exercise by building on a strong conceptual framework.
Thank you very much, Daniel and Francisco. We have to move on, but thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. So next we move on to our presentation by Christopher Ngosa. And we will be listening to a video presentation at this moment that Christopher has presented. And after the presentation, Christopher will be there to take up your questions and answers. Okay, let's move on to the video next.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this presentation. My name is Ngosa Christopher. I'm from Ngosa Development Consultancy. Today, we are presenting a paper entitled Who Will Save Africa from Its Poverty? An analysis using the sustainable livelihood approach to poverty. The question of who will save Africa from its poverty is a fundamental question for both policymakers and academicians in both developed countries and developing countries. We are looking at the livelihood of the poor, as livelihood is a true measure of poverty. In answering this question, it will take an understanding of the extent of poverty in Africa and prescribe which approaches can eradicate poverty by giving a critical analysis of the approach. Africa is faced by a lot of challenges, ranging from political, economic, social, and cultural problems. Poverty is one of the major challenges which different actors have taken keen interest in trying to eradicate, both at international level and local levels. A lot of initiatives, such as the Millennium Development Goals to the current Sustainable Development Goals have been initiated to eradicate poverty, not only globally but also in Africa. According to the World Poverty Clock, there are about 400 million people in Africa living in extreme poverty, with a current escape rate of -11 per minute. This, simply interpreted, means that each minute an African falls into poverty, and those who had escaped poverty cannot sustain these poverty escapes. African countries dominate the ranking of 23 and 30 poorest countries in the world. Poverty is defined as a multidimensional human condition involving sustained or chronic deprivations of resources, capabilities, choices, security, and power necessary for the enjoyment of an adequate standard of living and other social, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. Then, the million-dollar question has been on how Africa can eradicate poverty, but mostly important, how can it sustain these poverty escapes? This calls for an approach which should reduce vulnerability, increase capabilities, opportunities, and access to assets by the poor. The prescribed approach to reduce poverty in Africa and improve the well-being of the poor is the Sustainable Livelihood approach to poverty. The Sustainable Livelihood approach to poverty helps development planners in understanding the livelihoods of the poor. It categorizes the factors that constrain or enhance livelihood opportunities for the poor. Further, as a tool in development activities, it helps both to plan development activities and assess the contribution of current development interventions. It is both important and interesting to note that Sustainable Livelihood approach to poverty is an approach which identifies practical priorities of actions to be taken to eradicate poverty, taking into consideration the concerns and views of the people concerned, which are the poor. The Sustainable Livelihood approach makes the connection between the people and the enabling environment, which influences the outcome of livelihood strategies. It is argued that anti-poverty policies mostly seek to help people escape poverty, but forgetting to address how people can sustain these escapes. The Sustainable Livelihood approach to poverty is made up of two aspects, namely livelihood and sustainable livelihood. Livelihood comprises of the capabilities, assets, and activities which are required to make a living. For clarity's sake, in order to make a living, assets can be further categorized into two forms. Tangible assets, which include resources such as land, livestock, trees, farm equipment, and water, stores, food, stock, and cash. The second form of assets are intangible assets, such as claims and access. The Chronicle Poverty Report of 2014 and 2015 argues that in order to get to zero poverty, livelihood should be sustainable. It is important to note that a livelihood is sustainable if it can cope with and recover from stresses and shocks, maintain or enhance its capabilities and assets, and provide sustainable livelihood opportunities for the next generation, and capable of contributing net benefits to other livelihoods, both at a local and global level, both short and long term. The Institute of Development Studies defines livelihood as one which can cope with and recover from stress and shocks, maintain or enhance its capabilities and assets, but not undermining the natural resource base. The Sustainable Livelihood approach to poverty is being used by different development organizations such as DFID, CARE, UNDP, etc. This approach has been popularized because of the failure by other approaches, such as the growth model, in eradicating poverty, but also because of the recent finding on the nature and understanding of poverty. There are basically three factors which have made this approach to be used for poverty eradication. The first factor is the realization that there is no automatic correlation between economic growth and poverty reduction, even though economic growth may be essential for poverty reduction. It is true, growth can reduce poverty if it expands the capabilities of the vulnerable and the poor to take advantage of the expanding economic activities. According to the Chronicle Poverty Report of 2019, there are countries with much growth but reduced poverty to a little extent. Governments of such countries focus on promoting growth from above, which involves formal and large investments, but growth from below, informal sectors, are forgotten. The second factor of why the sustainable livelihood approach is being used for poverty reduction is the realization and recognition that poverty is not an issue of just low incomes, as is perceived by the poor and many of us today. But we need to realize that poverty is multidimensional, involving other aspects such as illiteracy, lack of social services, bad health, vulnerability, etc. The third aspect of the use of the sustainable livelihood approach is that there is that realization that the poor know best what is needed to improve their well-being and should be consulted when designing poverty programs which aim to improve their state of well-being. The project performance is improved by participation of the poor and having a say in the designing of the project. The sustainable livelihood approach, ladies and gentlemen, is said to have development activities which are people-centered, responsive, and participatory, multi-level, conducted in partnership with public and private sectors, dynamic and sustainable. Livelihood strategies and outcomes. Livelihood strategies are said to aim to achieve livelihood outcomes. Livelihood outcomes in the lives of the poor include more income, improved food security, increased well-being, reduced vulnerability, improved human dignity, and sustained use of natural resources. Ladies and gentlemen, according to the International Development Studies Institute, it has outlined a tentative framework known as the Sustainable Livelihood Framework to analyze sustainable rural livelihood. And this framework includes livelihood resources, vulnerability context, livelihood strategies, and institutional processes. Livelihood resources are made up of capital assets, which are needed not only by the poor to make a living and escape from poverty, but by everyone. These assets are divided into 5 categories, namely human capital, for instance, knowledge, skills, good health, ability to labor; natural capital, which is made up of natural resources, stocks, land, trees, air; social capital; financial capital; physical capital. The sustainable livelihood approach to poverty provides, through the sustainable livelihood framework, a framework of analyzing livelihood and serves as an entry point for development interventions for both government and donor countries. The emphasis is that there is no particular entry point, such as is emphasized in the sector approach. Livelihood analysis of household communities using the livelihood framework also looks at the vulnerability context, as this affects our livelihood strategies choices. People move in and out of poverty and sometimes fall back into poverty, as is noted by the Chronicle Poverty Report of 2014 to 2015. And this vulnerability aspect is captured under the vulnerability context. Vulnerability in this context refers to the insecurity in well-being, and vulnerability has 2 facets. An external side, which consists of shocks such as conflict, illnesses, floods, storms, droughts, and other diseases. Critical trends, which range from the global and national level trends. And seasonality. And it has an internal side, which includes defenselessness. In the livelihood framework, there is also the aspect of policy and institutions. it is argued that livelihood strategies and outcomes are not just dependent on access to capital assets or constrained by vulnerability aspect, but by the environment, structure, and processes under policies and institutions, and these affect livelihood strategies and outcomes. In this context, structures refer to the private and public organizations that formulate and implement policies, trade, etc. Processes refer to laws, policies, regulations, social norms, which determine where the structures operate. How sustainable livelihood approach works in reducing poverty. The sustainable livelihood approach looks at the poor as development partners in decision making and how to reduce poverty, rather than looking at them as victims and vulnerable. Ladies and gentlemen, FAO argues that sustainable livelihood approach has three defining principles which make it possible for it to reduce poverty. Firstly, it addresses vulnerability and increases resilience to shocks. Secondly, projects which contain the sustainable livelihood always have a component of building assets. The vulnerability of the poor when faced with shocks can be reduced by assets ownership. In order to sustain escape from poverty, an increase in household income is not enough to prevent impoverishment, but it is important for households to acquire capacity to prevent themselves from falling back into poverty. Thirdly, projects which contain the sustainable livelihood principle always have the livelihood focus aspect. According to FAO, the view of projects that tend to have livelihood focus tend to reduce poverty than those focused on achieving growth. Policies should be put in place in order to keep the newly non-poor out of poverty. There are several case studies where the sustainable livelihood approach has been used in Africa and has reduced poverty. For instance, in Zambia, from 1996 to 2001, FAO implemented a project known as Improving Household Food Security and Nutrition through Community Empowerment in Luapula Valley. The key entry point was agriculture. In the case of Gambia, the Lowland Agriculture Development Program, which was implemented by IFAP from 1996 to 2014, is one of the cases of sustainable livelihood approaches. The entry point here is still agriculture. The Chronicle Poverty Report argues that the poor remain poor because they have little or no access to vital livelihood assets, and the few assets they have provide low returns. The poor are excluded from taking part in various aspects which shape their well-being. They lack access to labor, goods, and money, or face unfavorable prices, etc. The poor are excluded by administrative and political institutions. This is the same explanation which is provided by the Sustainable Livelihood on why the poor are poor. The Chronicle Poverty Report of 2014 to 2015 observes that drivers of chronic poverty are said to be context-specific and the solution too. The sustainable livelihood approach is seen to be context-specific in its nature and is appropriate to tackle these drivers of chronic poverty. But when it comes to reducing poverty, ladies and gentlemen, there are certain issues which policies should address across all countries, and some of these are vulnerability of the poorest, their access to assets, and years of good quality education, gender inequality among the powerless. The high level of corruption in Africa has increased the poverty and vulnerability of the poor in this part of the region. The sustainable livelihood approach is an example of how important academics and education are important in fighting poverty. It is argued that the sustainable livelihood approach is a typical example of how research influences policy. The sustainable livelihood idea originated from research and practice and traveled to its policy destination, where it was adopted by the British Department for International Development as part of their foreign policy. Sustainable livelihood approach is an intellectual and practical, powerful idea which has been communicated among researchers, practitioners, and policymakers with regards to eradicating poverty. To answer the question of who will save poverty from his, who will save Africa from its poverty, ladies and gentlemen, the real.
Thank you very much. We had to pause the video as we are running out of time. We will try to see if we can connect Christopher Ngosa to bring him onto the podium. It somehow looks like, unfortunately, we cannot connect. We cannot even locate Christopher. I think it's because of the internet connection. He has not been able to join. And this is exactly the reason why he chose to record his presentation rather than going through live discussions. I think we have had, unfortunately, it's time for us to move towards closing closing our panel. I would like to bring the co-convener, Denis Seving, on the stage as well. There has been interesting presentations, especially the first three presentations, which were more quantitative in nature, and the final presentation, which was more qualitative. And definitely in the first three presentations, we saw how multidimensional analysis can be conducted to understand or analyze policies better. And this is a step, we are moving in the right step in that sense. I myself has been working on multidimensional poverty analysis quite a lot. Denis has been working recently. She published a paper on analyzing multidimensional poverty in the UK, and hopefully we will be able to produce more interesting work in the area of multidimensional poverty, and which definitely let us move beyond the income approach. So I would like to thank you, Denis, as well, for helping me. Michael Connier, who is sitting there. You cannot see Michael, but he's helping from the background to all of us. I thank you to all the four presenters for taking your time and giving wonderful presentation, and also the audience for being patient with us throughout the process of the panel. So with that, we close this panel session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suman. We are absolutely gutted we couldn't welcome you on our global campus in Birmingham, but equally grateful for technology for allowing us to carry on with our special session. So thank you very much for all the fabulous presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.